Welcome everyone. This is the first of two videos on foreign policy. And as you'll see, it's related to the political science subfield called international relations. The whole point of this really is to talk more about foreign policy as a policy area than about international relations as such. But international relations is a subject that we teach in political science 184. Many of the theories of international relations are, I'm going to talk about them and tell you what they are, but I want to mainly relate this to the United States, because this is a course on American politics. So we're going to talk mainly about U.S. foreign policy, how it's made, what the various approaches are, and in video number 2, the second of 2, we'll talk about the history and the evolution of U.S. foreign policy over time. So let's talk about how these two subjects are related. International relations is, as I said, it's a subfield of political science. One of the very large ones. A lot of people who study political science are in what we call IR. That's the abbreviation, IR. The intro course to that is Political Science 184. I can't do justice to all of that. It's an enormous field. But just briefly, it concentrates on the ways in which nation states and other actors, such as multinational organizations like the United Nations, the World Bank, the European Union, NATO, etc., how all these international actors, some of which are nations and some of which are not nations, how they interact with each other. That's international relations. So they talk about the diplomacy, diplomatic relations among nations. A lot of IR scholars study war or conflict of all types, and sometimes what they call international security, which is defense policy, treaties, and this sort of thing, all the ways that nations try to guarantee their security and their national defense. Nuclear proliferation, international law, we teach a course on that from time to time, and a very popular course. Globalization, which is the way the world has increasingly become interconnected economically, politically, diplomatically over the last, well, it's gone on for many decades, but certainly over the last 50 to 60 years at an accelerating pace. Nationalism and populism, that is rising tides of nationalism where people are in many countries around the world are pushing against international relationships and wanting more to promote the interests of their own country. Economic development, arms trafficking, how global finance works, environmental problems, that's a very important topic of international relations, terrorism, human rights, etc. Now, U.S. foreign policy is the place where this whole field of international relations, which again is so broad we can just barely touch on it in this course. Where does international relations intersect with U.S. public policy? And that is what we call U.S. foreign policy. In other words, what we're going to focus on here is not just the whole field of IR, but how the United States relates to all of that, the different alternatives in U.S. foreign policy and its history and how it has evolved over time. At one time we were just a little remote colony of a gigantic global empire, and then we became the most powerful nation in the international system. And how did that happen? I'm going to talk with you about that in video number 2. So we'll be talking really about how the U.S. relates to the world, what the options are and how we can do that, and how our relationship to the world has evolved over time. Now, the central concept, I just want to talk about some of the central concepts in IR because that's the only way to really introduce the study of U.S. foreign policy. The key concept is that there is in the world of international relations, in global relationships, there's no sovereign. You know, in everything we've done in American politics, everything we've talked about, there's a sovereign, the national government or the state governments. You know, these are sovereign powers. They have authoritative control over people and resources, and they can make decisions, and they can enforce them, and they can use force literally to do those things. But in the field of international relations, there actually isn't a sovereign. Now, you know, you might say the United Nations. Well, the UN is not a world government. It can't settle disputes. And So the question then becomes, what theories, this is what IR is about, what theories do we need to understand how nations relate to each other, given that there's no sovereign? Now, one common popular school of thought is what's called realism. And that is the argument that nations are the unit of analysis. If you look at countries as if they are real, nation states are the real entities that make the decisions. And it takes the position that they try to balance their power. They try to seek maximization of their national interest. They make treaties, they make decisions, and that these dynamics are kind of rooted in human nature. That this is inevitable, that nations will compete with each other for power, struggle to balance power out, make alliances with each other when certain nations get too powerful, etc. An alternative to that is there are various theories of neoliberalism, neorealism, and regime theory, alternative theories that say, no, wait a minute, it isn't pure anarchy. Actually, what happens is that nations create international orders out of anarchy. And so this can lead to debates in U.S. foreign policy between what we call unilateralism and multilateralism. And I'm going to tell you what I mean by that. But the alternatives to realism, like neoliberalism, regime theory, etc., they argue that it isn't all competition in the international arena. Nations are interdependent on each other, and economics are very important. So it isn't just about power relationships. It's also about economic relationships. And that because of the importance of economic relationships, nations develop ways of cooperating. They create international order out of anarchy because they need to, because they need each other for economic purposes. And then other analysts focus on dependency relationships. They say, well, if you actually look at the way nations are really organized, you have some nations that are more central to the power and economic relationships than others. Like, for example, the United States is a very powerful nation, and they look at it as if it were the center of a lot of relationships, and other nations that are more peripheral, that relate to the bigger nations. You could argue that, for example, China is another very central nation. I don't mean geographically, but I mean in terms of its relations with other countries. It is heavy. It is at the center. It has a lot of economic, political, and military power. And so this is a different way to look at it, to say, well, not all nations are equal. Some are central, some are more peripheral. And then another interesting theory is what is called modernization, which is a theory that nations are all moving kind of in the same direction. Now, personally, I do not believe the evidence supports that, but it is an argument that many American presidents and foreign policymakers have tended to believe. And of course, they believe that everyone wants to be like us, that everyone's moving toward being like us. In the 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union and its breakup, many people began to get very triumphalist about all this and say, oh, this proves that everyone's going to end up being like us. But that's not the way things have actually gone, and people have their own ways of doing things. And I've modeled here this is the game Prisoner's Dilemma. Now, this is a thing often in the study of international relations. Some people like to use what's called game theory. They like to they like to analyze international relations as if it were a game played according to rules. And one of these games that you may have seen is called Prisoner's Dilemma, and I won't go through all the details of it, but basically it is a game that is designed to model a situation where people have to decide whether to trust each other or not. Like two convicts who are locked up in separate rooms in a police station being questioned for a crime they committed, and the question is whether they should remain silent or squeal, so to speak, or implicate the other person. And it's called Prisoner's Dilemma, and it is a model of how nations may interact with each other when they don't know whether they can trust each other or not. Game theory. That's one of the games. Now, one of the leading exponents of realism was this man, Hans Morgenthau. And as I was saying, his view was that the international realm is pure anarchy. The independent units in that system are states, nation states. Not people, not corporations, not the UN. Nation states are the actors. That's all he wanted to focus on. And he says they have power, they're potentially dangerous to each other, they can never be sure about the intentions of other states. Note that prisoner's dilemma thing I just said. And the basic motive is survival, maintaining their sovereignty. And his argument was that states are rational and that they make their decisions strategically. Now, this is called realism. That is a one theory. I personally do not think this is always a very good way to analyze international relations, but it is one of the most common. Many American policymakers have subscribed to all these beliefs over the years. And of course, then they argue that this comes right out of human nature. That this is the way people are. People are innately competitive and individualistic, etc. Now, these are all questionable assumptions, but that is what Hans Morgenthau believed, and many American policymakers over the years have believed this. Alternatives, what we call neoliberalism, and this is confusing because this is not the same. When we talk about neoliberalism, we're talking about policies involving privatization and globalization, etc., that came into effect with Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and so forth in late 1970s. This is a different use of the same word by, in this case, international relations scholars, and what they use it to mean a very complex world order in which nations are extremely interdependent. Joseph Nye and other people are the leaders in this school of thought, and their view is that, as I was saying when I summarized this a few minutes ago, despite the fact that there's no sovereign, despite the fact that it's technically anarchy, nations develop complex relationships, primarily economic, that lead them to become interdependent on each other. And these relationships lead to cooperation. So they say the realists are wrong because the realists think everybody just wants to compete. All these nations want to compete. And this neoliberal alternative says, no, they cooperate. They don't always compete. They like to cooperate. And where they can't, like I said, there's no sovereign, so you can't actually take, arrest people, have the police come arrest them for breaking a treaty or something. But they say the way these relationships are enforced and cooperation is enforced is through what they call regimes. And regimes are kind of systems. Informal systems of norm. They can be formal. I shouldn't say informal. They can be informal. They can also be formal. But they're systems of norms, rules, expectations, and procedures that guide nations in knowing how they should behave. So, this is an important concept in international relations, and it is an important aspect of our foreign policy, because presidents have differing, I guess you would say, faith in the power of these regimes to keep nations in line. We have some presidents who believe that we should be, as you will see, that we should be involved with the world. We should be involved in international organizations, and they believe that we can trust nations to cooperate with us. There are other presidents who think, well, it's just all brutal competition, and you have to just maximize your own self-interest and lie, cheat, and steal because everybody else will. That would be like, for example, when Trump was president, that was his philosophy. A very much cutthroat and no belief in international cooperation at all, except for some unknown reason with Putin in Russia. That was about the only nation he wanted to cooperate with, which is actually a rival of the United States. But most other presidents have believed to some degree that we can actually trust these regimes to maintain some semblance of order in international relations. Therefore, we can trust other countries. And then, organizations have been created to kind of monitor and regulate these regimes of norms, rules, etc., such as the European Union and the United Nations. And so some of these things have some level of enforcement. So there you go. That is a very quick overview of the theories of international relations. U.S. foreign policy is made differently than the other policies we have talked about. We've talked about how our country is basically a liberal democracy where we have elections, we have theories of open government, we have courts that pass on the constitutionality of legislation and executive actions and so forth. And we've talked about how laws are made by Congress, how executive actions are made by the president, and so forth. Well, foreign policy is made differently than that often. It is a complex mixture of diplomacy, military power, intelligence, meaning agencies like the Central Intelligence Agency, cultures, and economics. Often it is undemocratic, meaning often foreign policy, unlike domestic policy, can be made in secret. And often it is made by political and economic elites operating in secret. The executive branch is primary, and that is, the president is very influential in foreign policy. And I remember we talked about that. You may remember we talked about that when we discussed the presidency. In foreign policy, the president has a lot more power to do things without even dealing with Congress. They can, and often in secret. They use the Defense Department, which is in the executive branch, the National Security Council, which is in the office of the president, the executive office of the president, the State Department, again, that's in the executive branch, the intelligence agencies, economic advisors, think tanks. Most of the primary tools for making and implementing foreign policy are in the executive branch and are ultimately under presidential authority. Now, the leading exception to that is congressional committees. And the number one committee in Congress that deals with foreign policy is the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. So the senators who are on that committee are often pretty well informed on the state of foreign policy, because presidents normally bring them into the loop on important matters. Presidents normally consult with the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations and sometimes other congressional leaders on important foreign policies, because there are times when they really do need congressional action. I don't mean that presidents can do everything on their own. Sometimes they need money. Sometimes they need treaties ratified. Sometimes they need political support. So often they do turn to Congress. But what I'm saying is, in domestic policy, you can't pass a law without getting it through both houses of Congress. Often in foreign policy, presidents deal with things without even asking for legislation to be passed. Now, where does this come from? The Constitution. You may recall that the Constitution took away from the states the power to do their own foreign policy, which they were doing under the Articles of Confederation. But as of 1787, those powers were taken away from the individual states and made the exclusive power of the national government. And most of that power was given to the president. Why? He's the commander-in-chief of the military. He is what is called the, quote, the sole organ of our national government, meaning the president makes the decision whether to recognize another nation's government. And the president proposes treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. These are all specific powers. Well, Congress has a hand to play too. They fund the military, they declare war, they ratify treaties. But here's the thing. Presidents don't have to go to the Senate because they can make executive agreements that have the same effect as treaties, but they don't need to be ratified. They can, and they do, engage in military action short of declaring war, so they don't even ask for a declaration of war. They may ask for an authorization for the use of military force pursuant to the War Powers Act, or they may not. But we would hope that they do. But again, sometimes presidents don't. The presidents also appoint ambassadors. The Senate has to confirm those. And so you can see that the Senate has a role to play here. But the president has almost all the most important powers, is the main spokesperson for our country and the number one decision maker in foreign policy. They are, in essence, preeminent. They rely heavily on other aspects of the executive branch, such as the National Security Council, an extremely important agency, part of the executive office of the president, and the State Department, the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security. The State Department supposedly formulates foreign policy alternatives. The Defense Department formulates military policy. The Department of Homeland Security is intended to coordinate all these different agencies that might be related to national security, so they all get on the same page, and things, the FBI, etc. And then we have the intelligence agencies. There are at least, and probably more, than 16 agencies involved in the collection and analysis of information. Now, all that filters to the president. The president decides what is classified and how high it's classified. So you see that flow of information goes through the president. And only if the president clears it does it go to other players in the system. Presidents normally involve Congress pretty directly, or at least congressional leaders. But again, it's up to the president. So you see, these congressional committees try to engage in oversight. If they think there's been a crisis or a failure of foreign policy, they can investigate it. They can hold hearings. There are other, as I say, there are other players. It's not 100% the president. There are also important business groups, defense contractors, interest groups that represent people of different ethnicities around the world. So for example, there are interest groups that represent the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee, the Cuban-American National Foundation. There are groups that where there are American citizens who are descended from or have immigrated from other countries, and there are interest groups that might get involved, particularly with the executive branch, to try to influence policy. There also are foreign governments that try to influence, and companies that try to influence our foreign policy. There are laws against a lot of that. The Foreign Agents Registration Act says if you're going to represent another country's government in the United States, you have to register. And a number of American politicians have been convicted of violating these acts because they have not registered. And they have been in this country trying to influence Congress or the executive branch in order to help another country like Turkey or Russia or something, but they didn't register. And so then they can get charged with crimes. And that happened a number of times actually during the Trump administration. Michael Flynn, his former national security advisor, and a number of other people got in trouble over this. Then there are other groups that get involved in foreign policy, think tanks like the Brookings Institution, the Heritage Foundation, and then the many, many what we call NGOs, non-governmental organizations like, basically not-for-profit public policy organizations, Amnesty International, Greenpeace, and many others. Now, let's talk for a bit about what the alternatives are for U.S. foreign policy. We talked a bit about the world of international relations, and so the question is, how should the U.S. develop its own policy with respect to the rest of the world? What should be our basic attitude? Now, there are three alternatives, broadly speaking, three broad approaches: isolationism, unilateralism, and multilateralism. And related to that is a kind of, pragmatism versus idealism. In other words, some presidents are very pragmatic. They simply want to accomplish something. And I mentioned President Woodrow Wilson was an idealist in foreign policy. He wanted to create international organizations that would prevent war and this sort of thing. And other presidents, I think, such as the first President Bush, very pragmatic problem solvers, saying, well, we're not trying to change the world. We just want to have the best outcomes in the short run. How visionary are you? That's another issue as well. But the main thing I want to focus on is these alternatives: isolationism, unilateralism, and multilateralism. Now, isolationism means, briefly, I'm going to expand on all of these, but it means basically the U.S. acting alone. Unilateralism means selective alliances and treaties with other nations from time to time that we deem to be in our best interest. And multilateralism means creating basically autonomous international institutions that we work through and with. Isolationism is an approach to U.S. foreign policy, basically says, don't get involved in any cooperative efforts to solve problems. In trade, just be self-sufficient. Produce everything that we need to the maximum extent possible. Build American, buy American. In national defense, just protect our own borders, maintain the strongest military in the world, and don't get involved in mutual defense agreements with other nations. Let them solve their own problems. In other words, take the position that if there are all these problems that affect other nations, let the other nations solve them. don't become involved in cooperative efforts to solve problems like nuclear proliferation or drug dealing or COVID or whatever. Just focus entirely on our own interests and our own actions. Now, many politicians, and the leading example is definitely Donald Trump, will sort of pander to those sentiments, by which I mean Pew and other organizations have found again and again that most Americans say that they think it would be better if we just dealt with our own problems and let other countries deal with their own challenges as best they can. In other words, there are a lot of isolationist sentiments in the American public. And many politicians like to kind of pander to that. However, the reason I say it's pandering is because everybody knows, who really understands foreign policy, that we've never actually been isolationist in practice. I mean, even during the American Revolution, we got the help of France. Otherwise, we never would have won our independence from England. We have never operated completely alone. And so, when Trump and people like this pander to these sentiments, they are really behaving in quite an unrealistic manner and encouraging Americans, they're misleading Americans to believe that it's possible to function that way. Given the nature of the globalized economy of today, given the kinds of challenges we and other nations face, such as nuclear proliferation, international drug dealing, and many, many other things, refugee flows from one country to another because of civil wars, isolationism would be national suicide. And there is nobody who actually understands foreign policy who really believes that isolationism is even possible, much less a good idea. So the real alternatives, even though you'll hear people say these isolationist things, I think very few people actually believe it could be made to work. I mean, the closest to it was Trump, who was just busy, wrecking our relationships with other countries, and then they all have to be restored because we can't operate that way. The real alternative is between unilateralism and multilateralism. And when I say unilateralism, that does not mean going it alone. That's isolationism. Unilateral means the U.S. engages with specific partners, other nations, for particular reasons at particular times to solve particular problems in the ways that we choose. We approach it, the politicians who believe in this want us to always be the dominant player in these relationships that we form. And they ought to always have it possible for us to withdraw whenever the costs outweigh the benefits in their view. So, for example, when the second President Bush 43, was president, he withdrew us from the International Criminal Court. He withdrew the U.S. So we don't want our soldiers and our politicians to be potentially charged with international crimes. But when he wanted to invade Iraq in 2003, he found international partners, particularly the United Kingdom. He said, would you go in on this with us? So that's what I mean by unilateralism. He did want to deal with other countries, but on an ad hoc basis, one at a time, special arrangements, special alliances for particular purposes, and then things we can always get out of. Now, multilateralism is the approach that Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and a number of other presidents have taken, which is we join with other nations in international organizations that actually have the power to address problems. That's the difference. Permanent, long-term international organizations, where we are usually a senior partner, but we don't necessarily dominate them. And we are then committed to support the existence of the organization. So, for example, the United Nations. Unilateralists will say, well, if the UN, we don't like the UN, we'll withdraw from it or something. A multilateralist would say, no, we need the UN. We work through the UN. We work through the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization. And that is why we led in the creation of many of those organizations. I mean, the UN headquarters is in New York City. We led in the creation of the UN. We wanted the UN. And that's the multilateral approach, where we value these other international organizations that can address global problems by mobilizing international cooperation. Now that, however, leads to a question, and I'll just pose this for you. How much power should these international institutions have? I mean, there's a picture of the International Court of Justice in The Hague in the Netherlands. But how much power should the UN have? Should it become like a global government? How about the International Court of Justice, the so-called World Court, which resolves international law disputes? How much power should they have? How about this one? The International Criminal Court, which is not part of the United Nations, it is an independent court that has the power to punish crimes such as genocide, war crimes, crimes of aggression, crimes against humanity. Now, the United States, withdrew from that under Bush. Now, should we be in it is a question. And how much power should they have? And would it be possible, for example, for our soldiers, our generals, our politicians to be tried for war crimes? We're very eager to see that done when other nations commit war crimes, but do we want it done to us? These are the kinds of questions that it raises. The World Trade Organization, the World Bank, very important in financing development around the world, the International Monetary Fund. How much power should they have? These organizations have a lot of power, particularly in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. That is, they tend, this is a criticism of them, I guess you would say, that all these international organizations tend to be dominated by the wealthy nations of the global north and tend to be imposing policies on the less wealthy nations of the global south. That's essentially a criticism of them. On the other hand, those organizations and the people who run them would claim that they're trying to help those nations develop economically. Again, very complicated topic. We have coursework on this. You can study it, but that's the dispute. Now, I mentioned that there are all these issues where international cooperation through international organizations or agreements is helpful. Here's a list of some of them. Terrorism. Well, is there any one nation that can solve that problem? Because the terrorists roam from nation to nation, right? Mass migration and refugees. Well, by definition, refugees go from one country to another. So how is one country going to solve this? Failed states and civil wars. Somalia, basically a failed state. States like Yemen that have have had really awful civil wars going on inside them. Human relief crises could be from natural disasters, many other things. Nuclear proliferation, I mentioned this several times, but this is a serious problem. What do we do? What can any one nation do about the fact that other nations are seeking nuclear weapons? One argument is the only way to fix this is through international agreements. Drug trafficking, arms trafficking, and then, of course, environmental issues such as global warming. There's nothing one nation can do to fix this. Don't all these problems require international cooperation? And then the question is how to do that through international organizations or ad hoc agreements. And that's what the multilateralists say. All these problems require organizations. So there's a quick one here. An example, the Syrian refugee crisis. In the year 2010, there were 22 million people living in Syria. In 2011, a civil war began in Syria. And I think it's important to understand why that civil war began. The United States in 2003 invaded Syria's neighbor, Iraq. And the United States, under President George W. Bush, basically destroyed the government, the entire government of the nation of Iraq, and replaced it with one that we approved of. And we thought, and the Bush and Cheney and these other people said that, they're going to welcome us with open arms. And instead there was a horrendous civil war that resulted, that lasted for a long, long time. And many, many, many people died in that civil war, including U.S. soldiers. Now, eventually, it was a long story here, eventually we withdrew from Iraq, and when Barack Obama was president. But it had spillover effects. The organization called ISIS came into existence, which was comprised in large part of people we kicked out of the Iraqi government, out of their security services, out of their military, etc. And they joined together with Al-Qaeda and other organizations in Iraq that came into the power vacuum we created when we invaded. And that crisis spilled over into neighboring Syria, leading to a horrendous civil war. It had other causes as well besides that, but our policies in Syria and Iraq contributed to a substantial extent to this, although, as I said, there are many other factors involved in it. But a horrible civil war began in Syria. And soon, 6 million Syrians out of the 22 million had fled the country. Most of them went to Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt. Many of them went into, once they were in Turkey, they were able to move from there into Europe. They were going to Italy. They were going to many countries throughout Europe, which caused all kinds of political crises in those countries. and another 6.7 million or more were displaced from their homes and moved elsewhere within Syria to avoid the civil war. So what we ended up with was over 13 million Syrians in different countries requiring humanitarian assistance. Well, isn't it apparent that there is no one single nation that could deal with this problem? It required international cooperation, and I've given you here. You see this flag of the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. That is one of those international organizations, part of the UN. There's a picture of a refugee camp that they set up, but this is just a picture of the unbelievable human crisis here. Just a depiction of essentially, what it was like. Many of these folks jumped on small boats and tried to cross the Mediterranean to avoid being killed in their own country. They fled. Some of them have drowned at sea. Many nations, including the U.S., agreed to help with refugee resettlement. And the United States and the United Nations have made commitments. As you can see, I've just given you some indication here of what those commitments were. The U.S. State Department has a reception and placement program. We are signatories to a convention and protocol relating to the status of refugees. We as a nation have made that commitment. However, do we live up to that? Well, in a case called Innovation Law Lab versus Nielsen, the American Civil Liberties Union alleged that we, as a nation, we do not live up to our legal and moral obligations to refugees. Where? On the border with Mexico. This is an ongoing conflict and issue and political football in the United States. During the Trump administration, there was a policy of forcing people seeking asylum in this country to return to Mexico. Now, the issue here is this, just briefly. Our laws, that is the laws of the United States of America, say that a person, any person who is fleeing persecution in another country, fleeing potential death, persecution, etc., in another country, can come to the United States, can cross the U.S. border and say, I am seeking asylum. And they must be allowed to file their petition seeking asylum. Well, the Trump administration said, we're not going to let you in the country to make that petition. So they kept them in Mexico. And it was argued that this is a violation of our own laws and our own commitments to asylum seekers. Well, it is a complicated issue. There are many different international agreements that might modify our initial commitment, and I don't expect you to fully understand all this, but just because it's a policy area that is very much in flux. However, understand that the whole idea of international cooperation about refugees, the reason so many nations have agreed to do their part to help them is because no one nation can solve the problem. They can't all go to one place. And so we make international agreements to try to deal with them. And often those international agreements cause a lot of domestic political discord. Then we have the question, another policy area. I'm not going to try to go through all of them, but just as the last policy area to talk about as an example of what we do with international cooperation is what we call nuclear proliferation. And so that is the spread of nuclear weapons from one nation to another. So what is the best way for nations to prevent other nations, from acquiring nuclear weapons? The general, I think, agreement is that the best way is through treaties. Something called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Most nations have signed it. There are 4 nations that three of them have nuclear weapons. India, Israel, and Pakistan have nuclear weapons. But there are 4 nations that have never signed the treaty. And international regimes are used to enforce these treaties. So here's where things stand as of 2022. 9 nations have nuclear weapons. There are more than 13,000 nuclear warheads. The vast majority of them, as you can see, about probably over 90% of them are in 2 countries, the U.S. and Russia. The other nations are the United Kingdom, France, Israel, Pakistan, India, China, and North Korea, with the approximate number that we believe they have. Now, if you look at the arrow next to the nation's name and number can go down, up, or it can be an equal sign. That is an indication as to whether they are reducing their number of warheads, increasing or building them, or keeping them the same. So you can see Russia increasing its number of warheads, the US reducing it, the UK increasing it, France and Israel staying the same, Pakistan and India both still engaged in a nuclear arms race, China and North Korea building more weapons. Now, this is viewed as a problem, and for people who believe in unilateralism and particularly isolationists, they need to answer a question. And the question is, how can you possibly stop the spread of nuclear weapons except through international cooperation? And so isn't it necessary for problems like this, and for problems like refugees and other problems like international terrorism, isn't it necessary for there to be ways for nations to cooperate and enforce their agreements to some extent, even without an international sovereign, but with international regimes that allow these things to be made real, to be made enforceable, so that we can deal with global problems in an effective way, that is, problems that affect all of us. Now, in the next video, that concludes this video. In the next one, we will go over the history of U.S. foreign policy. So thank you.